A senior attorney advisor at the FCC. He's an adjunct professor of law at American University. Can I say your current and upcoming role? Is that fair?
Let's say a major cloud web services provider.
A major cloud web service provider, which you have heard of and likely use. You'll be the director of policy for Japan.
Head of policy.
Head of policy for that. Jim's a delightful friend of the program, a polymath with great expertise in law, policy, entrepreneurship, business, technology, telecoms, a black belt in judo, an accomplished rock climber. The list goes on and on. A fascinating partner for lunch, as I learned happily today, and a great friend to the program. Privileged to introduce, excited to hear, Jim Miller.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I am delighted to have the honor to speak with you all today and share at least some of my thoughts. And I think, I'm especially proud to have received an invitation as a Hatfield distinguished lecturer. I'm not so sure about the distinguished part, but I think what we're going to talk today about relate to things that you guys are probably experiencing every day. What are the sorts of things I should focus on? What sort of bang for the buck do I get for trying to study this topic, this specific narrow, possibly interesting niche versus something else? And I think what I'll try to share, at least from my experience, is that people like Dr. Hatfield, who are well regarded in almost every circle that you'll work through, in policy, in cybersecurity, of course in telecommunications. What is the mix? What's that magic sauce that people like Dale Hatfield bring to the table that you can probably learn something and take away and help to model your experience going forward with? I do want to make, of course, the very clear and distinct point that anything I say today is not representing the FCC or the federal government, which is shut down, or the Japanese government. Anything that probably makes any sense you can credit to my great mentors like Dr. Hatfield. But outside of that, we're going to be trying to make some sense of a lot of things that, on the surface seem to make sense together, but oftentimes when you start digging into the weeds are very difficult to wrap your head around when you're presented with really specific problems. And some of the things that we're going to try to talk to today relate to how things like cybersecurity as a broad topic relate to historical debates around things like intellectual property, or today, things that are more focused, and certainly things that we'll want to spend some time on, personal privacy, especially as it relates to Asia, which is a major jurisdiction for web services, for example, for internet commerce, for a lot of the policy debates that are presenting the most thorny sorts of negotiations that people are talking about today. And so, at a high level, how do you balance these kinds of concerns? How do you take what could be an almost limitless supply of competing priorities and sort that out in a way that you can identify the things that may be the most valuable for the particular, maybe the audience or the class of problems that you're dealing with, make sure that the protection is appropriate, the level of attention is appropriate to that, without imposing a lot of burdens that rob you of the value of the whole effort. You don't have a business if there's no business. A lot of, especially attorneys like myself, might go into a discussion and have an argument with the business side of the folks about risks and returns and things like that. And it's sort of the standing joke is that you invite the lawyers into the room so that they can say no first, because lawyers oftentimes aren't always about balancing those risks in the same way as a business person would be. So we're going to talk through maybe some strategies or some thoughts that you can help develop some frameworks. Because ultimately what we want to do is develop some sort of a mental map, a framework for utilizing security in a way that enforces the sorts of policies or the expectations that people find most important. Because at the end of the day, that's a really interesting and helpful way, at least for me, to see that nexus between what cybersecurity is, how it relates to things like privacy, like trust, how identity is a part of that debate. So with that, I'm going to talk about rock climbing because, well, it's Boulder, so we can't talk about rock, anything in Boulder without talking about rock climbing. But I sort of guide on the side, and especially with youth or adults, that are dealing with fear of heights and things like that. One of the really common discussions that comes out of any sort of guide's introductory discussion with a client is that there's a separation between what is scary and what's dangerous. What are the sorts of things that we can identify that I can understand this is a cognizable risk, here's what I know about it, I know sort of the engineering around it, I understand the system, I understand the architectural sort of layout of this problem, and then I can make an informed decision about whether or not I want to climb that wall, scale this mountain, or not. Because ultimately, there aren't inherently safe systems. There's no 100% secure solution. There's always trade-offs. You're going to be trading off scalability or usability or all sorts of other really important and valuable characteristics. And so we need to understand what are the things that are driving these discussions. If some of these things are fears, maybe those fears are because there are risks that are unknowable or simply undiscovered, or maybe there are things that we're just not comfortable with. We understand those risks and we're just not ready to make those sorts of risks go. How to sort of like develop that set of skills that are necessary for that practice is another thing that we want to talk about today, because we want a smiley face at the top of the mountain. And so those fundamental questions, generally you'll see in various forms, but boil down to what is it you're protecting? Why are you protecting it? What's the value? What are the sort of risks associated with that? What's essentially that, that map of problems? And then how do you protect it? Fundamental questions, and we're going to talk through some of those in some specificity at the later. We're going to go through how many folks here are sort of network engineers, come from that background. Great. How many folks, raise your hand if you think of yourself more as a computer scientist? How many folks are a lot more comfortable maybe in a client server environment than say sort of a web service API world? That was a bad, poorly framed question. All of you are either comfortable with one or the other. So, how many folks here are in a law program or a policy program, a pure policy shop? Everyone here, of course, is enrolled in the TCP program, right? Absolutely. That's the correct answer. So a lot of this stuff is going to be old hat for you, but we want to sort of like refresh and lay some foundations. We talked about, what are you securing, why are you securing, how are you securing. Certainly in this area, there's a lot of developed literature, especially over the last maybe 15, 20 years, that have provided a lot of, very measured analysis and thoughts around this. A lot of these things talk about, whether or not you're focused on a network environment, or you're focused on sort of the device side. What sort of resources and assets are you looking at? Are you interested more in about people exploiting weaknesses in a system for some purpose, maybe to raise permissions or to go outside of an ACL box? Or is it more about like loss of confidence in expectations? Are you looking at the loss of access to a network or a resource? Are you looking at someone taking advantage of a resource that you expected to monetize over some period? So there's different permutations, and a lot of times people will describe confidentiality and integrity, and then a sort of, the availability of computer network assets as some of the baselines for that. And there's sort of some tried and true methods around this stuff. Especially for protecting, say, confidentiality. If you reduce the sorts of information to something that's, quote, anonymous, that's helpful because then you might retain certain assets that are not anonymous, and then you can separate what you're exposing outside. You might talk about legal mechanisms, which we tend to oftentimes ignore, but things like non-disclosure agreements. You're not going to go into any company today for a job interview and not have a non-disclosure agreement in not many cases. Why is that? Well, they're helping to limit the kind of information that goes in and out, and it's also part of that general theme of protecting confidentiality. Terms of use are oftentimes used in that same way. Licensing. And so a lot of this stuff are things that are focused on the business relationships and not necessarily even technical. If you look at how you protect integrity, a lot of people will talk about what we're really talking about. Is the system free from manipulation from a third party? Are we looking at a loss of data or some sort of lack of access issues? How do you preserve sort of the canonical source of that? A lot of times you're thinking about a system that's secure and one that's maybe not secure as sort of a dividing line between the sorts of assets that you still remain and have a high level of confidence or trust in, and those that maybe you wouldn't rely on because you don't trust those systems as much. Other interesting things, especially around the network and computing resource side, we all know what a DDoS is, or sort of denial of service attacks, sort of that class of things. But essentially doing something that might look innocuous that then has a consequence that makes that resource unavailable for some reason, or degrading maybe the speed that another party might access it, and real world consequences to that. If you're working in a trading environment, for example, that could be a difference between a trade that goes through or not, or maybe hundreds of millions of trades. And so we sort of come back to those sort of definitional questions about, basically what are we protecting, why, and the hows of the cyber scenario. And I think it's interesting, again, to step back and think about, we have a term now that's like cyber physical assets. But people find analogies really useful in this space. And if you think about things like banks or locks on your apartment or how you deal with your wallet, these sorts of scenarios oftentimes come into analogies that you'll see. And if you're talking about your wallet, usually you're talking about your personal identity. You might have, for example, your driver's license that could be used to maybe get a loan or buy a car, or could be used in other ways. But you're also looking at your financial assets. You got cash in your wallet or a credit card. If your home is compromised, you try to prevent that by putting locks on it. So there's access issues that you can see. And then when someone is thinking about how can you protect your home against other sorts of concerns, well, there's a very different sensibility about even your home address. When I was young, when I was in college, it was very common to look in the phone book and just randomly find people's names and where they lived. That doesn't exist today. And so a lot of these things tend to evolve. And then you think about how the smartphone pulls a lot of these things into the same bucket. You're talking about all your financial assets. You're talking about very, very specific information about your personhood. All those sorts of things then get rolled up into it. And so when we're looking for analogies, it can sometimes be very, very challenging to use things like banks or my apartment lock or things like that, because those analogies get strained when there's a lot of things that tend to be on the same device or within an environment that then are remote. And so we can see that there's a limit to how useful some of these analogies can be. So when we turn to the technical side, we're going to talk about a couple cases after I set up a couple other things. When we were talking about how you protect, for example, confidentiality, the law and policy are a huge mechanism for doing this, and largely underrepresented in discussions with a lot of cybersecurity folks, especially folks that have been traditionally focused on intrusion or other sorts of problems. But how do you protect assets using policy or law is a focus, and certainly the focus of today's talk. So naturally, you're going to want to talk about how lawyers or policymakers think about laws and policies and how they work. One place to start is, of course, source of law. So if you take a class in comparative law, for example, I love teaching comparative law because one of the things that's special about comparative law is you're taking different jurisdictions, different countries' laws usually, and you're comparing them to see how they function differently with the goal of understanding how law functions generally. What is the function of law? How does it function differently with different social constraints? Do people use it differently? Do they ignore different kinds of laws? Are they structured differently? So a lot of times, we start with, who makes the laws? Are there international entities or state entities? But other categories of laws. Big boxes that we're going to talk about with the policy side are regulatory laws. Places like the FCC or NTIA, or entities in Japan might be the Ministry of Communications or the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. So a lot of countries have different ways of dividing up these sort of problems. Sometimes there's digital economy sort of ministries. Sometimes people have traditional telecom entities managing them. But they tend to usually be part of this regulatory space where there's a statutory law that comes from the legal side, as lawyers might think of it. And then it's delegated down to someone who knows the details about a specific system. Enforcement is obviously another place where, especially, there's a lot of international cooperation. If you work with embassy staff or you're involved in agency review, especially like in the financial crime space, a lot of the things that people do on a day-to-day basis tend to be enforcement problems. People are doing investigations, they're doing coordinated sort of reviews of records. And we'll talk a little bit maybe towards the end about how things, like blockchain, have been a focus, especially in the enforcement environment, in the financial law context, because what people expected about how there's intermediaries and banks and how money moves in certain ways and physical constraints on the moving of large amounts of value no longer exist according to a lot of, especially the cryptocurrency space. And so how did that change enforcement? There's a lot of people thinking about that right now and how they can deal with those different problems. And so at the end of the day, there's always going to be that technical element. There'll be legal and policy elements, and then sort of human factor problems, if you will. And an exchange on best practices, an exchange on sort of how people understand that environment is also part of how international sort of exchange on these topics often evolves. And so, again, going back, you can imagine if you're talking about some basic sort of cybersecurity problems. So when we talk about data, we usually differentiate between data that's at rest or data that's in transit. You can imagine how, in some cases, an international enforcement action might be playing off different aspects of these problems. So, for example, let's say there's a digital asset that moves through networks, and then maybe it arrives at a different jurisdiction, and then it sits there for whatever reason. It might be intellectual property. It might be a financial asset. It might be personal information. It might be an unlawful intrusion into a system. They might share sort of like features at the technical level and then be very, very different when you're talking about the content layer. But you can imagine that division being useful. So understanding how cybersecurity is studied in different contexts and different frameworks can be really helpful. People often, differentiate between weaknesses and how attacks sort of like look. And you can imagine, you probably heard about backdoors or how different sorts of network attacks look. Physical attacks are often differentiated. And then, most of us have heard about snooping or spoofing attacks, social engineering, and certainly they appear in those lists of things that you tell the consumer to be cautious of and how they can better protect themselves, as well as, best practices that come out of that discussion. But at a basic level, oftentimes people, there's all sorts of different frameworks. They're talking about, can you identify the problems? A lot of times you don't and you can't. Maybe someone else did, and then the aspects of information exchange and best practices come into play. But, for folks that work in this space, they often talk about how difficult it can be identifying, classifying, but then even sharing that information across different entities. You can imagine there might be, let's say it's a company, and they had an intrusion, and it took them a little while to find it, and there's some exposure concerns there. There might be some challenges for someone inside of an entity like that who would want to share that information with other people so that they could prevent attacks for reasons that are outside the scope of the technical problems. And so, the remediation and the mitigating of vulnerabilities is often, part of that general business problem as well. And the entities that help support, the exchange of information naturally oftentimes are domestic, and then they have interactions on binational or multinational settings. But the mitigating of risks and sort of those best practices, people are also, we've had a number of years of study in these areas. And so there are generally well understood things that people do share about, and certainly there's value in spending time and studying the specifics of those sorts of problems. This quote is from a book that was talking about the formation of privacy law. In around 1974, there was a workshop in the US government that was exploring the concerns that were evolving from an increased use of data processing in the US government for different sorts of information. And that Hugh report collected a lot of information as generally sort of a baseline for that discussion. But certainly there were people at the time, that were really concerned that the task was really, really big and it would be difficult to solve, especially by government regulation. But what came out of the Hugh report in '73, and then as that evolves into the Privacy Act, there was sort of a well-understood set of things, problems and sort of solutions to general sorts of privacy problems, especially with respect to individuals and how governments might collect and process information. This was pervasive, this report influenced a lot of legislation in other countries, and certainly was the starting point for a lot of the legislation in the United States. There are a lot of people who talk about, the connection between security and privacy. There's a lot of conferences that tend to double up that. And understanding sort of the government piece, how that relates to domestic sort of obligations and things on carriers or entities that are doing e-commerce. Generally speaking, we're going to talk a little bit right now about how that legal framework looks and how we can sort of take away a template. But in general, we want to go back to the idea that when we're thinking about legal solutions or policy solutions, I like to describe them as sort of an emergent feature of three factors, if you will. And certainly, technology is a big part of that. If you don't have a wheel, you don't have problems about wagons or cars. If you don't have computers, people don't argue about having intellectual property in a digital form. So technology naturally is a big part of how we deal with these emerging problems, and certainly the scope and nature is to some degree set by how the technology evolves. But even more important are things like consumer behavior and adoption. So there's everybody who's been in technology a while can point to at least 5 or 10 really cool technical solutions that evolved that nobody ever used, that died out. That either died because something else was more popular or cheaper or just happened to be at the right place at the right time. And so consumer behavior is a really important part of how technology law tends to evolve. And certainly another feature is the actors that use that outside of the consumers, the businesses themselves. What were the prevailing business practices, for example, around intellectual property and how it was licensed, even up into the late 90s? Well, if you were an entrepreneur, say in the Bay Area, the mid-90s, there were lots of solutions, for example, that were around that could stream audio. But nothing really had traction until the iPod. And a lot of people talk about this as sort of a really interesting sort of business case. Why did the iPod succeed where others didn't? And it's still sort of more a realm of sort of mythology that Steve Jobs went down to LA and did whatever Steve Jobs does and then managed to get licensing rights for content that others were just unable to get. How did that work? Well, we don't really know the details, but it certainly, if they hadn't had the kind of music collection and were able to do the licensing at $1 a song and things like that, it's unlikely that we would see iPhones and maybe even sort of the technology that we see today. So if we understand that there's basically this relationship between a technology sort of path, a consumer adoption or behavioral path, business practice path, we can look to different sectors and then see what sort of problems emerge depending on those sorts of sectors. And if you look at the things that we're probably closest to, internet and telecom technology, we have a good feel for things like CP&I. Has everybody heard of CP&I? Does anyone know what that is? That is your consumer privacy information, your network information that your carrier has, for example, who you called and the numbers associated with that. There's other sorts of things in the telecom space, and certainly in the US and Asia, sometimes they vary, but if we look at transportation issues that are evolving, people are concerned, for example, about records around their subway travel or their travel using the magic little electric boxes that help you go through the tolls quickly. Medical devices, how are those implemented? What sort of information is collected? What sort of cybersecurity mechanisms exist for protecting things like, I am a cancer survivor and I'm monitoring my glucose levels or something like that. Finance and banking, another really big area. And well, naturally in the medical space, we could point to HIPAA. In the financial space, there's specific legislation. And so one of the interesting sort of takeaways here is that when we're dealing with these technology problems, there's going to be, from a lawyer or a law and policy perspective, some sort of obvious guideposts for us to look to. And you know, we talked about sort of where the law comes from, international versus national versus regional jurisdictions, public versus private law, the kind of laws that we're talking about, are they statutory or regulatory? And a lot of times it's useful to make a little matrix, and then you can imagine, like, if there's a federal regulator, for example, at a national level, and they're doing things in the public law space, they're regulating, and then all of a sudden times change and they stop regulating in that box. Well, the problems don't go away. The problems will look for a resolution somewhere. So they might drop down to the state level. So you can imagine if there were, let's say, telecom-related privacy problems. You might imagine a national regulator might look at it. There might be a change of times. That law might go away. Where does it go next? Well, maybe it goes down to the state level. Alternatively, you might see it leave the regulated space and go to the private law space, which we could probably understand as litigation. Now, there's really great things about litigation. It can be very efficient for certain kinds of problems, but usually not for kinds of problems that are a class of problems that affect a big group of people. So there are consequences to how those problems move around in those spaces. We talked about the idea that there are different sectors that you might imagine technology law problems emerging from. And you might have specific solutions that you might impose cybersecurity burdens or things that are specific, sort of privacy related. And usually when legal scholars talk about how you categorize these problems, oftentimes they'll describe them as unitary or omnibus versus sectoral approaches. So for example, in the United States, for a very long time, we were sort of the sectoral approach. We had a lot of very different laws that addressed cybersecurity and privacy-related problems. So for example, HIPAA relates to medical information, and financial services law would impose obligations on certain entities to handle financial-related information in different ways. The FCC might do things. The FTC might do things differently. And so this approach takes advantage of a very sort of diverse and oftentimes disorganized legal approach. Sometimes that's just what you have. It works organically. There's definitely trade-offs to different systems. But the counterpoint to that, especially the one that was more dominant in Europe, was this unitary approach or this omnibus approach. And the perspective there is that some problems you just have to have one guy in charge. Everything needs to go in one box. You need one standard. And that should be sort of the national law that touches everything. And you might be even more expansive. You might say that the minimum standard should be an international sort of standard. And certainly you can see areas where there are definitely unitary approaches that the US is an enthusiastic supporter of, and in many cases may have originated. But there's a little difference in terms of perspective. Do you have a system where each regulator sort of is, well, the most informed and the most competent to evaluate sorts of problems and weigh and balance risks and returns? Or is there a kind of problem that is so pervasive and has such sort of a universal map that it's better to have a single entity making those sorts of decisions? I think we're especially in the privacy space, we're looking at how the EU approach is right now being adopted by a lot of jurisdictions. Japan, a lot of other jurisdictions in Asia. There are a lot of states that are exploring essentially what the safe harbor treatment is under the new EU GDPR. Is everybody familiar with GDPR? Yeah. So the General Data Protection Rules versus the directives. And so this idea that, especially for privacy, maybe there was a stronger sort of theme, at least in the US context, towards a sectoral approach that might be shifting more to a unitary approach, just by the de facto role that GDPR now is controlling in a lot of other jurisdictions. It's interesting to note, though, that even if you look at the history around the GDPR and sort of data protection in Europe, Germany, much like the United States, is a federal jurisdiction. And if you look at some of the history around data protection law that sort of leads into GDPR, German states in particular, one in particular, was quite influential. And so, you know, at some level, you look at enforcement, you look at how GDPR is sort of evolving. The Japanese case, for example, there's 30+ guidelines describing different permutations of problems. Here's how you should do de-identification. Here's how you should address it in this sectoral context, blah, 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 blah. So, you know, there might be sort of an organic relationship. You might not necessarily start with the unitary approach and then end there. It may be something that will evolve. But going back to our idea that there are sort of 3 factors that are influencing how these problems will likely progress. This quote at the top, I think, is really, really interesting. So Tim Cook, does everybody know who Tim Cook is? Like he invented the Macintosh or something, I don't know. But his quote was really telling. He made this statement in China, actually, that without sort of the variety and depth of innovations that occurred in Japan, the iPhone would not exist. Now, the iPhone is manufactured in China. The discussion was like around, should you be sourcing and moving production facilities and fab facilities to China, labor or not? Responding to that, he's saying, well, you know, it turns out that labor prices are not really the driver. It turns out that engineering talent is a bigger driver. If you try to find fabrication engineers in the United States, mixed signal engineers, it's always been very difficult, but now majority of folks that you might be able to source from a human capital perspective are in China, and that's a driver according to the CEO of Apple. And so what we might want to take away from this is, if you look at where technology came from, how it's evolving, what sort of policy problems have evolved and where, pausing on Japan for a minute is interesting. So in 1999, for those of us that were in Japan, you'd come back to the US and you'd say, hey, there's this really super cool thing in Japan. It's like a phone, but it's like a computer, but it's got like the internet, and it's I mode, and yeah, usually it was difficult to explain that even to friends and relatives, but when they started talking about computer phones, it was just beyond people's recognition. The smartphone existed in Japan in 1999 in essentially a cognizable form. And if you think about mobile wallets and the evolution of financial transactions, very, very early, the Suica system, which is a hardware-based IC sort of system with a lot of really interesting proprietary sort of engineering components, was widely adopted in Japan and then spread to first the local coffee shop and the place that was selling the newspaper to basically anywhere to be a mobile wallet solution. And if you look at sort of what's going on, especially in Asia, a lot of the technology path, as well as the consumer behavior, as well as the business practices, are also continuing to sort of push the gamut. So if we're talking about, you know, smartphones in 1999 being pervasive in Japan, when did they start to be really a thing in the US? Maybe mid-2000s-ish. You know, that's 15 years, 10 years, whatever ahead of the adoption curve here. If you look at Suica, mobile wallets and the notion that financial transactions were digital and that people were carrying financial assets, these are all really interesting. And then if you shift to things that are of interest right now, aging populations and the replacement of human labor with AI-based robots. It's happening today. There are hotels that you can go to in Tokyo right now, walk in with your Suica, and a robot will set up your room. You go to the room, there's nobody there. There are no people in the hotel. Now, I'm not sure that's a great thing or not, but that is the consumer behavior right there. And then we pause for a moment on, well, how does this relate to things like policy? what's the policy angle here? Well, we talked about SICA. Well, SICA is the element, of the JR train systems, the Japan Rail Train Systems financial system, and how they were trying to digitize their kiosks. And so a number of years back, JR had this really cool data set that they developed. All these interesting sort of behaviors and things that were part of people's timing when they would enter, how long they would be in the system, what sort of train paths they'd choose. You can imagine if you're doing any ML work, all sorts of fun things, really valuable, useful things that you could use to improve the delivery of your train service, maintenance schedules, all sorts of valuable sort of insights you could draw from that. Well, JR saw an opportunity also with a company, Hitachi, which is a major IT provider in Japan. And they reached an agreement to share some of this information with Hitachi. But, again, this is before the age of de-identification and k-anonymity and L-diversity analysis. They said, well, we probably don't want to just give them the records. We probably should clean them up a little bit, anonymize them. And so they did. And, they did a de-identification. And in the next slide, we're going to talk about maybe why there were some concerns around that. They didn't necessarily have a third-party sharing sort of field or section in their privacy policy, and there wasn't really an opt-out at this point. And so when people started hearing what kind of information was in this data set, they saw, oh, well, the raw records include things like your full name, oh, shoot. I've stepped on something. You good? Anyway, is it back up? So they were looking at the data set, and they're like, well, there's phone number and birth date and the station they got on and off, the fees they paid, purchase history, other sorts of identifiable information. And the engineers looked down, and they said, well, I tell you what, we're going to replace the unique ID with something else. So does everyone know what Postgres is? You can run, how to type a select statement. If you got a primary key and you're trying to wash it and then pull it out of another system, it's fairly routine. You swap out the number, not so hard. In fact, you can do it in a lot of standard SQL statements. Full name, should we include that? Everyone agrees we should include it? Anyone disagree? Good, so we'll leave it in, right? No, but well, apparently some people disagree. They redacted the name. Oh, go figure. And their phone number. Everyone okay with including the phone number? No? Okay, well, I guess we'll have to redact that. But let's leave in the birth date, the gender, all the stations you got on off of, V. So there's a lot of really interesting research and writing in the field of de-identification. If you've read here, some of the mathematical things that I find really helpful when I'm doing this sort of data science work are L-diversity, which sort of like, you want to get a feel for what sorts of exposure concerns there are. K-anonymity is the other big one where you're looking at the number of records that are identical for what could be quasi-identifiers, things that you care about. And a big number is better because the more records that share properties, the more likely you are to be able to protect them, reducing essentially the risks for clustering and other sorts of mathematical attacks. But you can understand that including the birth date and the gender might be a little problematic. Well, so it turns out this was a source of a lot of angst. There was a lot of discussion about it, and it led Japan to further refine their data protection, personally identifiable information laws. And so the takeaway from here is, if you're coming from a jurisdiction that's outside of the United States, if you're coming from somewhere in Asia or Africa or Europe or other jurisdictions where, you're bringing sort of a different perspective, different kinds of consumer behavior. What's expected? What are the sort of things people would just naturally say are okay or not? What are the sorts of business practices that people look at? What are the sorts of things people find interesting or technologically useful? Varies dramatically. And you can almost think of, you go back, everybody's had an anthropology class, right? If you haven't, they're really, really great. I love anthropology. And a lot of times, there's a line between cultural anthropology and physical anthropology. And cultural anthropology is basically, what did you have for dinner? How did you say thank you? And what did you do before or after that, interacting with people and groups. And so the social aspects of how people use technology are more important in many cases than the technology itself. So I think, with that, maybe we'll close and maybe move into some questions. There's certainly more we could talk about, but I think we can certainly work it in to the rest of the talk. Lloyd, do we want to maybe take a few questions? How's that sound? If you have a question, why don't you raise your hand? We'll walk around with the mic. Yeah, great. You get the moderator privilege.
First mover advantage. So I'm curious about the U.S. position in this dynamic. You bring up GDPR, you bring up sort of technology business practices, consumer behavior, technology culture in Japan. And both of those are, from a U.S. perspective, tied by the U.S. definitively not a first mover. So in some ways, GDPR shaping our legal culture. What do you see there in terms of, is this first mover advantage or is it bleeding edge? And do you see the U.S. position changing? To be honest, in a context of a shutdown government, are we going to be sort of terminally behind?
Thank you for your question. Are there other questions? No? I think what I would do is suggest that a lot of law and policy problems tend to have a historical thread. And so if you roll the clock back about 10 years, 15 years ago, most of what we were arguing about with respect to cybersecurity and privacy and network management were about copyright. And so at the time, the big thing that was valuable on internet networks were content that people were starting to make available from sources that were largely US interests. And as we saw that sort of transition between basically illegal downloads into some content that was licensed into stuff that was a little heavily regulated, there were cases around things like Napster or other things that sort of led the space. There were things like DCSS and the interaction between technical flexibility and sort of the kind of regulation that you might see, and largely this sort of sectoral approach. And so the problems tended to settle in places that were doing copyright or network stuff. And on sort of the network side, carriers were really struggling because they had provisioned networks for the last 100 years using twisted pair copper wires. And those wires were capable of providing a lot of throughput for certain classes of uses. And so if you're talking about internet or live communications, US telecommunication networks were really, really great in a lot of respects. We had free local dial-up. There was a lot of explosion in terms of adoption. But when the use started to shift into things that were heavier in terms of the amount of throughput demand, some users were using it, some weren't. And so networks were becoming congested, according to a lot of the things that we would read or we could measure. And so the regulations tended to be focused on those sorts of problems. Now, we don't really talk a lot about the risks of, for example, a ActiveX video graphics device driver being the source of a major cybersecurity concern. They certainly were more of an interest, say, 5 or 10 years ago when people still cared about people not being able to pull digital content off of the stream and the network layer and trying to copy out bits from a buggy device driver. So again, sort of an elevation of privileges or some sort of exploit like that. But we do think about it in other ways. Like, for example, if that exploit now was providing file access that was exceeding the privileges of that task in a way that you could get local databases on a smartphone that included financial information, for example. You could imagine an app being the source of a data concern. Because certainly we're talking a lot more about data that pertains to individuals and sort of their browsing habits or their purchasing habits or other sorts of information about them. And of course, still about copyright, but less so. And so I would say, the US approach, if we describe it as more sectoral than sort of a uniform omnibus approach, I like, because I think that the kind of legal structure that we have that delegates and divides legislative authority and regulatory authority in ways that empower regions and states, that empower different classes or sectors to sort of really dive in and dig in on a problem and know it deeply, and then make very measured decisions about what to regulate and how. I think there's a lot of value to that perspective. And so if we look at the progress, if you will, over the last, say, 2 years on the privacy front, I would encourage you guys to look at things like the broadband privacy rules that were adopted by the FCC in 2016 that pertain to the kinds of information that a carrier might have access to that a platform provider might not. And again, there are a lot of really important discussions that we need to continue. How do you create a structure where one kind of business isn't disadvantaged unfairly by a burden being placed on them and not another one, which is a sort of a source of a lot of that history. So maybe that dialogue will continue and maybe accelerate. I think the other thing, though, that from sort of a looking forward perspective that we may look at is the role of advertising. And if you think about, roll the clock back to the late 90s, I was in the Bay Area. A lot of people that were on the app side or sort of the application layer side were largely focused on getting, seed funding in, maybe a couple rounds, developing a customer base, and then developing some sort of a model that they could provide services to users that were really valuable, but in a way that didn't require a subscription model. Now, some of that is, it's difficult to do microtransactions even today. It's difficult to price things below a penny. It's difficult to track use and billing, even in a system where there's like big blocks. So there are challenges that maybe come from the technical side, but also maybe business side that haven't really evolved, because we still see a lot of businesses that are advertising based in some sense. Either they're leveraging the kind of information that's available and then using that to help fund their businesses, or otherwise. So maybe there'll be more discussion about, what could you imagine as a subscription? What would the price be for a subscription service that covered a lot of the sorts of things that maybe you're getting today for free, or in some way that are not directly charged, but maybe are not going to be advertising supported? I think that's probably an interesting discussion that will evolve. Did you have a question?
Yeah. So I was curious, when you're looking at the slides at the very end, it looked like you might have gotten past, it looked like a picture of a bootloader on something. And a lot of your discussion seemed to be about protecting consumers from their information going out to other companies, what you're talking about with IC cards. Exactly. So I was kind of curious, how do you see this going on the side of the actual hardware developer and protecting their IP from the consumer who might want to exploit a certain thing with a custom ROM or something along those lines. Excuse me. What do you kind of think of that as when you have things like bootloaders that are locked from the OEM? How do you kind of see that playing into all of this?
So just a show of hands, how many people have used fast boot before, are familiar with the term fast boot? So a couple other user-based tools that are not fast boot based, but there are a set of tools that initially were sort of focused on developers that would exploit sort of low-level connectivity between generally a PC and a phone, a smartphone. And if you've ever worked in embedded systems, who's familiar with JTAG ports? Kind of the similar idea that you have an interface into what is probably some sort of an embedded device, and you're able to modify the environment in ways that might be necessary or helpful. At a high level, most consumers are familiar with this in the form of a BIOS. So a PC boots up. You see the screen sometimes. A lot of us, we end up playing around in there, and then our PC stops booting. So maybe it's not always good to goof around on. Do it on your sister's computer, maybe. I don't know. But Not the family one. Don't do that. But the idea that, if I had this pop up on my screen, right? And let's say I've got my desktop at home, super killer game machine, awesome, and it's XP. I mean, you would have some concerns. A, it hasn't been supported for a while. All sorts of security implications on having this operating system on your PC. But imagine an environment where this doesn't pop up, and you're not able to put a disk in and reformat the hard drive and let the device boot. So we would probably find that really curious. I don't want to go to Walmart and buy a computer and then not be able to upgrade from Windows XP. But if you look at the kinds of environments that are largely evolving on the smartphone side, they're evolving towards what a lot of us would have thought of as embedded devices. And there's a lot of value to having a system that is very tightly controlled. You can imagine, if you had a pop-up window and people could sort of willy-nilly install stuff. I know like 3 of us know what that screen is, but okay. There'd be risks associated with that. Like you could do crazy things. Like you could do crazy things, but other people could do crazy things. So there's been a real sort of progress, especially in the cybersecurity space, to addressing the risks that consumer space maybe are not well prepared to address and therefore need somebody to step in because they get upset about it. Now, one solution is to lock everything down so nothing can be changed. Okay, well I get it. Well then who's in charge of sending me my new upgrade disk? And that's a question that's not answered in the United States right now. There are a lot of proposals around, maybe there should be classes of devices that are essentially just essentially a disposable smartphone that you buy and then you get what you get and that's it, or stuff that's maybe a little bit different. Maybe the model is different. My personal view is that environments that I can take responsibility for, that the user has control over, offer a lot of benefits. And so if you have a PC at home and you see XP pop up and you see maybe an article and maybe they're reading Ars Technica. My mom reads Ars Technica. It doesn't all your moms, everybody's mom reads Ars Technica. Maybe not, but they might see it in the New York Times that says, there's operating system dangers and you should upgrade your PC to blah, 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 version 10 or whatever. Well, okay, that's something someone can carry their PC to Best Buy or Geek Squad or whatever, and they can fix it. Now, it's difficult right now for almost any modern smartphone to just take it back to either the vendor that you're getting service from or even to the manufacturer and get that. So I think it's an open question. Personally, if you want to do some more research, this is where that policy sort of discussion comes in. The Library of Congress's Copyright Office handles this discussion, and they made a decision a few years back that it's okay to essentially hack, but to modify software on smartphones, but not on tablets because we can't describe them. There's no definition. That was the justification. Now, if any of us in this room can't distinguish between a tablet and a phone, I don't know. Maybe there's a job for us at the LLC. But that's a perfect example of where there wasn't maybe as much interest in it. People didn't really take it on themselves to sort of come after it. But there have been examples, COPA, SOPA, those sorts of things where for whatever reason there were interest areas. So again, it's an area of it less being technology and more maybe being consumer behavior. If you demand a certain kind of product, you're likely to get it in the marketplace. Yeah.
So this has become more of a question of consumer definitions, because around that time, if I was not wrong, the term phablet was widely tossed around Congress willy-nilly with no understanding. And that's how I'm going to end that topic right there. A lot of our senators are kind of this not getting the terms. They're approaching 70 plus years, so we got to keep that in mind sometimes. And a lot of the senators are not familiar with these sort of tools that are, how do I put this, moving way faster than even most of my generation can't even keep up, right? So this is an exponential increase of open source and availability of tools today for software.
Absolutely.
Thanks to the internet, thanks to Facebook, thanks to all these companies pushing these tools out to stay competitive. One of the concerns for operating systems, specifically embedded ones, is if we start expanding the definitions of the operating system, we start entering the territory of back to the old question of who owns the operating system and who we have to start breaking up bigger companies again, such as Apple and Google, which are no different from, well, ironically, 20 years ago, Microsoft and Apple.
Good comment. Yep. So I guess the point to take away from that, thank you for the comment, is that this is a cybersecurity problem, right? It doesn't necessarily look like a cybersecurity problem, but these are the sorts of things that as someone who has prepared themselves adequately on the technology side can enter a sort of discussion and say, I understand bootloaders. I understand microkernels and how they interact with macrokernels. I understand how to write compilers. I understand operating system theory and queuing and all this other stuff. I can help with this. And so what I would encourage you guys to think about as sort of the takeaway is that programs like yours oftentimes intersect with places like in DC. And there are a lot of places that you could go and find problems like this and sometimes have really interesting internships, and sometimes those internships turn into full-time jobs. As somebody that's been a regulator for 17 years, next week, I can tell you that it can be a very satisfying career and offer a lot of really exciting problems. With that, I think I'll close. Dale, did you have any? I wanted to give you a chance. You didn't raise your hand, but I wanted to give you a chance to comment if you had any closing thoughts.
I think my closing thought is that you just saw a person who can go deep, as you could tell, on the technology side, and he can go deep on the legal side. And if you can do that, you can kind of write your own, and really write your own ticket right now. I continue to learn. To this day, I keep learning from James. And so I guess what I'm trying to say very inartfully is I'll put my ITP hat on and say, gee, lawyers, you ought to go over and pick up some courses in ITP, and my office is actually in the law school. So over there I would say, hey, you lawyers ought to go over to the engineering school and pick up some technical courses as well. And my model is James.
Thank you very much.
So please, everyone, let's thank Professor Miller. And because you are a Hatfield, and because we view you as an exceptional scholar who sees things from strange and exotic vantage points, we are presenting you with this. And Dale, please come here. And there is a need for a handshake.
Thanks, Dale.
And thank you all for coming. Technology, cybersecurity, and
Policy.
policy. Thank you.
Great. Professor Curry, thanks so much. Appreciate it.